Right now, somewhere in America, a baby boomer is arguing with a millennial about politics. Somewhere else, a Gen X manager is trying to mediate between them. And across the country, Gen Z is watching it all unfold on social media, wondering what kind of world they're inheriting. These aren't random conflicts. These aren't just personality clashes or differences of opinion. According to a theory that's been gaining serious attention since it accurately predicted our current era of upheaval back in 1997, these generational dynamics are part of a massive historical pattern that repeats every 80 to 100 years. And if that pattern holds, we're approaching the most dangerous and transformative period in living memory. In 1997, two historians named William Strauss and Neil Howe published a book that would either make them prophets or laughingstocks. The Fourth Turning laid out an audacious claim. They argued that American history, and really all of Anglo-American history going back 500 years, moves in predictable cycles. Not vague patterns or general trends, but specific, measurable cycles that last about the length of a long human life. Roughly 80 to 100 years. And within each of these cycles, called a saculum, there are four distinct eras, four turnings, each lasting about 20 to 25 years. They called these turnings the high, the awakening, the unraveling, and the crisis. Think of them like seasons: spring, summer, fall, winter, growth, flourishing, decay, death, and rebirth. And just like seasons, they always arrive in the same order. Always. The book made specific predictions. It said that sometime around 2005, America would enter a fourth turning, a period of crisis comparable to the American Revolution, the Civil War, or the Great Depression and World War II combined. It said this crisis would build through the 2010s and reach a climax sometime in the 2020s. It said institutions would crumble, polarization would intensify, and eventually, something would force a complete reorganization of American society. When the book came out, America was booming. The internet was exploding. The stock market was soaring. Peace and prosperity seemed permanent. Critics dismissed Strauss and Howe as cranks peddling historical astrology. Then 2008 happened. The financial system nearly collapsed. Occupy Wall Street erupted. The Tea Party rose. Political polarization reached levels not seen since the Civil War. Suddenly, people started paying attention to this book that had predicted, years in advance, that America would be entering a period of profound crisis right around this time. Now, here's what makes this more than just an interesting historical curiosity. In 2023, Neil Howe, the surviving author, published a follow-up book called The Fourth Turning is Here. In it, he doubles down on the original prediction. He says we're now deep into the crisis period, and based on historical patterns, we're approaching the climax. He predicts that by the early 2030s, somewhere around 2030 to 2033, America will pass through what he calls a great gate in history. A moment of such intensity and transformation that when we emerge on the other side, the country will be fundamentally different. The old order will be gone. A new order will have taken its place. And the generation that comes of age during this period, the millennials, will be the ones who determine what that new order looks like. If you think this sounds far-fetched, consider this. A completely different researcher, using completely different methods, arrived at almost exactly the same conclusion. Peter Turchin is a complexity scientist who studies historical patterns using mathematical models and big data. In 2003, he founded a new field called cliodynamics, named after Clio, the Greek muse of history. Turchin doesn't study generations or cultural cycles. He tracks hard data, economic inequality, elite competition for power, state fiscal health, popular living standards. He feeds this data into mathematical models and looks for patterns across centuries of history. In 2010, based purely on these mathematical models, Turchin predicted that the 2020s would see a massive spike in social and political instability in America. He said the conditions that lead to revolution, civil war, and state collapse were building, and they would reach a breaking point around 2020. He was right. The 2020s have delivered pandemic, economic disruption, political violence, and a level of institutional crisis that would have seemed unthinkable just a decade ago. Two completely different approaches, one based on generational patterns and cultural mood, the other on mathematical modeling of structural forces, both pointing to the same time frame. Both saying the 2020s and early 2030s are when everything comes to a head. So what exactly is the fourth turning theory, and why does it suggest that 2025 through 2032 will be the critical years that determine the shape of the next century? Let's start with the basics. Strauss and Howe noticed something that historians had somehow missed, or at least never systematized. They noticed that major crisis periods in Anglo-American history happen with remarkable regularity. About once every 80 to 100 years, and these aren't just any crises, these are existential crises, moments when the very survival of the society is in question, moments when old institutions are completely destroyed and new ones are built from scratch. Look at American history. The Revolutionary War began in 1773 and the crisis resolved by 1789 with the Constitution. That's the first fourth turning in American history. 80 years later, almost to the year, the Civil War erupted. 1860 to 1865, with Reconstruction extending to the early 1870s, that's the second fourth turning. Another 70 years pass and the stock market crashes in 1929. The Great Depression and World War II consume the next 15 years. That's the third fourth turning, ending in 1945. Now do the math. 1945 plus 80 years puts us right around 2025. And if you mark the beginning of the current crisis at 2008, the way Strauss and Howe and most observers do, then 2025 is right about the midpoint, the point where we'd expect things to start accelerating toward the climax. But why 80 to 100 years? Why does this pattern repeat with such consistency? The answer is both simple and profound. It's the length of a long human life. Think about it. If you're born in 1945, right at the end of a massive crisis that killed tens of millions of people and completely reorganized global society, you grow up hearing stories about it. Your parents lived through it. Your grandparents shaped their entire worldview around it. The lessons are fresh, the memories are vivid. The society that emerges from that crisis is built by people who remember what happens when institutions fail, when polarization gets out of control, when conflict goes too far. But now, fast forward 80 years to 2025. Anyone who actually remembers the crisis as an adult is either very old or dead. The lessons have faded. The institutions that were built in response to the last crisis now seem permanent, natural, maybe even oppressive. A new generation has come of age that takes those institutions for granted, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, the society begins to unravel the very structures that protected it. This is the fatal flaw in human social organization. We forget. We forget what happens when we let inequality get too extreme. We forget what happens when we let political differences harden into tribal warfare. We forget what happens when we stop maintaining the institutions that hold society together. And after about 80 years, enough of the people who remember are gone that we have to relearn the lessons the hard way. This brings us to the four turnings themselves, the four seasons of the saculum. Understanding these is crucial because each turning has a completely different mood, different priorities, different generational dynamics. And the transition from one turning to the next isn't gradual. It's abrupt, it's jarring, and it always catches people by surprise. The first turning is called the high. This is spring. This is what America experienced from 1946 to 1964. Post-war prosperity, strong institutions, civic unity, a sense that we're all in this together. The society has just emerged from a crisis, and everyone remembers why cooperation matters, why institutions need to be strong, why individual desires sometimes need to be subordinated to the common good. This is an era of confident expansion, new suburbs, new highways, new families. The mood is optimistic, conformist, and a little bit boring. Individual expression takes a backseat to community cohesion. Then something shifts. The children who grew up in this era of enforced conformity reach young adulthood and rebel. They look at their parents' world of gray flannel suits and white picket fences and find it spiritually empty. They want meaning. They want authenticity. They want to break free. This is the second turning, the awakening. Summer. In America, this was 1964 to 1984, the consciousness revolution, campus protests, the counterculture, spiritual seeking, civil rights, women's liberation, the questioning of every assumption the high had taken for granted. This is an era when institutions are attacked in the name of personal and spiritual autonomy. Young activists look back at the previous high as an era of cultural poverty and oppression. They tear down the social norms, challenge authority, and generally make their parents deeply uncomfortable. But they also revitalize the society's values. They inject new energy, new perspectives, new moral visions. Then comes the third turning, the unraveling. Fall. This is what America experienced from 1984 to 2008. The mood shifts again. The passion of the awakening has burned itself out. The institutions weakened during the awakening are now revealed to be fragile. Individualism, which was liberating in the awakening, now becomes corrosive. Everyone's out for themselves. Trust in institutions collapses. Political consensus fractures into competing values camps. The culture wars rage, scandals multiply, nothing works the way it's supposed to. Economic inequality soars as the regulations and norms built during the last high are systematically dismantled. People sense that something is wrong, that things are coming apart, but they don't know how to stop it. They retreat further into their own private worlds, pursuing personal fulfillment while the public square descends into chaos. And underneath it all, pressure is building. The seeds planted during the unraveling will sprout during the crisis, and then comes the fourth turning, winter, the crisis. This is where we are now, and this is what historical patterns suggest will intensify dramatically through the late 2020s and early 2030s. In a fourth turning, the availability of social order is low, but the demand for it is high. Everything that was unraveling in the previous era now breaks completely. The institutions that people had learned to live without suddenly become desperately necessary. But they're not there anymore. They've been hollowed out, delegitimized, defunded, abandoned. And so the society faces an existential threat without the tools it needs to respond. This is when crisis becomes catastrophe. This is when the old order collapses and a new order must be built. And history shows that this process is never peaceful. It's never smooth. It always involves profound conflict, often violent conflict, and it always demands enormous sacrifice. Let's look at how this played out in previous fourth turnings, because the patterns are remarkably consistent. Take the last one, the Great Depression and World War II, from 1929 to 1945. The unraveling before it, the 1920s, looked a lot like our recent era. Roaring prosperity for some, massive inequality, weak government, rampant speculation. Culture wars between urban cosmopolitans and rural traditionalists. Everyone thought the good times would last forever. Then, October 1929 arrived and the stock market crashed. But even that wasn't the real crisis yet. That was just the catalyst. The real crisis was what came after, when it became clear that the old economic order was completely broken and needed to be rebuilt from scratch. The New Deal represented a massive expansion of federal power that would have been unthinkable just years earlier. And then came World War II, a conflict so total that it required complete mobilization of society. Women entered the workforce in unprecedented numbers. The government directed the entire economy. Individual rights were subordinated to national survival. Japanese Americans were interned. Millions of men were drafted. Cities worked around the clock producing weapons. And through all of this, a generation came of age, the so-called greatest generation, that defined itself through collective action, teamwork, and shared sacrifice. They were the hero generation of that fourth turning. Go back to the Civil War, 1860 to 1865. Same pattern. The unraveling before it saw the country fracture along sectional lines. Institutions weakened. Political compromise became impossible. Extremism flourished. Violence broke out in Kansas, in Congress. Everywhere the two sides collided. Everyone could see it coming, but nobody could stop it. And then Fort Sumter was fired upon, and suddenly the nation was at war with itself. Not a limited war, not a political conflict that could be negotiated, a total war for the nation's survival. By the time it ended, 600,000 people were dead, slavery was abolished, the federal government had been massively strengthened, and the entire social and economic order of the South had been destroyed. Out of that crucible came Reconstruction and a fundamentally transformed nation. Go back further to the Revolutionary War, 1773 to 1789. Same pattern again. The unraveling before it saw growing tension between the colonies and Britain. Institutions like the colonial assemblies and the authority of the crown were in conflict. Then came the catalyst, the Boston Tea Party in 1773, and everything accelerated. War, Declaration of Independence, years of brutal fighting, and finally victory, but that wasn't the end. The Articles of Confederation didn't work. The country nearly fell apart. It took the Constitutional Convention in 1787 to finally create new institutions strong enough to hold the new nation together. That Constitution, forged in the crucible of the crisis, lasted for the next saculum. Notice the pattern. Each fourth turning begins with what Strauss and Howe call a catalyst event, something that breaks the sense that we can keep muddling through. In the last fourth turning, that was the stock market crash of 1929. This time, data indicates it was the financial crisis of 2008. After the catalyst comes a period they call the regeneracy, when people start to recognize that major change is necessary and begin to organize around new coalitions, new movements, new leaders. This time, that arguably happened with the 2016 election when both parties saw insurgent movements challenging their establishments. After the regeneracy comes a period of escalating conflict and instability, as the old guard fights to preserve what's left of the old order while rising forces push for transformation. This is where we are now. And historical precedent shows that this eventually leads to the climax, the moment of maximum danger and maximum possibility. This is typically a few years of such intensity that they compress decades of change into a short span. Think 1932 to 1945, or 1860 to 1865, or 1776 to 1783. These are the years that define the entire saculum. And here's what makes the late 2020s and early 2030s so significant. Based on the timeline that started with the 2008 catalyst, we're approaching that climax period now. If the pattern holds, sometime between now and 2033, America will face a moment of truth, a moment when the accumulated crises, the unsustainable contradictions, the structural problems that have been building for decades, all come to a head simultaneously. What might that look like? History doesn't repeat exactly, so we can't know the specifics, but research indicates certain possibilities seem more likely than others. Economic crisis is almost certain to play a role. Every previous fourth turning has involved a moment when the economic order breaks down completely. In our era, that could be a debt crisis, a currency crisis, a breakdown in global trade, or all three at once. The structural problems are there. Government debt at levels never seen outside wartime, massive private debt, a financial system dependent on constant intervention by central banks, extreme inequality creating political instability. Any of these could be the spark. Geopolitical conflict is another strong possibility. Every fourth turning in Anglo-American history has included at least one episode of total war. Not limited war, not police actions, but wars where national survival is at stake. In our era, that could involve China, Russia, Iran, or some combination. The post-World War II international order is clearly breaking down. Alliances that seemed permanent are fraying. Authoritarian powers are challenging democratic ones. Nuclear weapons remain in the background of all these tensions. Historical analysis suggests that external conflict often serves to unite a fractured society. It's terrible to contemplate, but it's what the pattern shows. Domestic political conflict might reach levels we haven't seen since the 1860s. The polarization that has been building since the 1990s shows no signs of abating. Trust in institutions continues to decline. Both sides increasingly view the other not as political opponents, but as existential threats. Some analysts examining historical patterns wonder whether America could face serious internal violence, attempted secession, or even sustained periods of civil conflict. This isn't alarmism. This is pattern recognition based on what happens when societies reach this level of elite division and popular anger. Climate and environmental disruptions represent a new element that previous fourth turnings didn't face in quite this form. Data shows that climate change is accelerating, with impacts that could be severe by the 2030s. Food security, water security, mass migration, economic dislocation from climate disasters, all of these could compound other crisis elements. Some researchers examining these patterns suggest that the fight against climate change might actually become the unifying crisis that this fourth turning revolves around, the way World War II unified the last one. Technological disruption, especially artificial intelligence, adds yet another layer of unprecedented change. By the late 2020s and early 2030s, AI could be displacing millions of workers, creating social dislocation on a scale we haven't seen since the Industrial Revolution. At the same time, AI could concentrate enormous power in the hands of whoever controls it. This combination of mass unemployment and concentrated technological power could create exactly the kind of crisis that fourth turnings revolve around. Now, here's where Peter Turchin's work becomes especially relevant. Remember, he's not studying cultural cycles or generational patterns. He's tracking structural demographic indicators. And what he's found is alarming. The three main drivers of social instability and potential state collapse are all flashing red in America right now. First is what he calls elite overproduction. This is when a society produces far more highly educated, highly ambitious people than it has positions of real power for them to occupy. Between the 1970s and today, the number of Americans with college degrees exploded. The number of people with advanced degrees grew even faster. The number of lawyers, MBAs, PhDs, all soared. But the number of truly elite positions, the positions where you wield real power in society, stayed roughly the same or even declined in some areas. This creates a massive pool of frustrated elite aspirants, people who did everything right, who got the education, who played by the rules, but who find themselves locked out of the positions they expected to occupy. These people become what Turchin calls counter-elites. They're smart, educated, capable, and angry. And they have both the skills and the motivation to challenge the existing order. Historical data shows this is the single most important predictor of political instability and violence. The second factor Turchin tracks is popular immiseration. This is when the living standards of ordinary people stagnate or decline over an extended period. Since the 1970s, real wages for most American workers have barely budged while the cost of housing, education, and healthcare have exploded. Younger generations face worse economic prospects than their parents. The middle class is shrinking. Economic anxiety is pervasive. This creates a population that's receptive to radical political movements because they have less and less to lose from disrupting the status quo. The third factor is state fiscal health. When governments face declining revenues and rising expenses, their ability to maintain order and respond to crises weakens. America's federal debt has exploded to levels only seen during World War II, and it continues growing with no plan to address it. State and local governments face pension crises and infrastructure needs they can't afford. The government's capacity to take bold action, to spend its way out of a crisis the way FDR did in the 1930s, is severely constrained. These three factors, elite overproduction, popular immiseration, and state fiscal crisis, feed on each other. When they all peak at the same time, which Turchin's data shows they're doing right now, societies historically face existential crises. And this is what makes Turchin's work so remarkable. He made his prediction about the 2020s back in 2010, based purely on mathematical models fed with historical data. He didn't know there would be a pandemic. He didn't know about any specific political events. He just knew that the structural conditions that precede major instability were building to a peak in this decade. The same peak that the fourth turning theory predicted would occur based on completely different reasoning. Two totally independent methodologies pointing to the same time frame for maximum crisis. So what happens when we reach the climax? How do these crises typically resolve? Historical examination reveals a few key patterns. First, there's usually a clear turning point, a moment when you can look back and say, that's when we knew how it would end. In World War II, that moment was D-Day in June 1944. The simultaneous invasions of Europe and the Mariana Islands, both were successful. Both showed that the Allies were going to win. It wasn't over yet. Another year of brutal fighting remained, but the outcome was no longer in doubt. In the Civil War, it was probably Gettysburg and Vicksburg in July 1863, or maybe Sherman's capture of Atlanta in September 1864. That's when it became clear the Union would prevail. For the Revolutionary War, it was the British surrender at Yorktown in 1781, though it took years more to ratify the Constitution. Neil Howe has suggested that for our current fourth turning, this climax moment will likely occur around 2030, give or take a few years. That's when he expects we'll see the decisive events that determine how this crisis resolves. After the climax comes what they call the resolution. This is when the winners separate from the losers. When new institutions are created to replace the ones that failed. When political parties are redefined. When national boundaries might be redrawn. When a new social contract is established. This typically happens in the few years after the climax, which would put us in the early to mid-2030s. And then, if the pattern holds, around 2033 or so, we enter a new high, a new first turning. The crisis is over, the transformation is complete, and a new era of strong institutions, civic unity, and shared purpose begins. But here's what makes this both terrifying and potentially hopeful. Fourth turnings don't automatically have happy endings. They're moments of genuine danger. Nations can lose fourth turnings. The Confederacy lost. Germany lost twice. Russia's fourth turning in the early 20th century led to communist totalitarianism. The outcomes aren't predetermined. They depend on choices, on leadership, on whether enough people can come together around shared purpose to build something better than what existed before. The opportunity is enormous. Fourth turnings are when everything becomes possible. When society is fluid enough that major changes that seemed impossible suddenly become inevitable. When new institutions can be built that will last for the next 80 years. When generational leadership emerges that shapes the rest of the century. And this is where the generational dynamics become crucial. Each generation has a role to play in a fourth turning, and understanding these roles helps us see how the crisis might unfold. The prophet generation, the baby boomers, are now in elderhood. They're the visionaries, the moral leaders. They grew up in a high, came of age in an awakening where they rebelled and found their values. And now, in this fourth turning, they're meant to be the wise elders who define what the crisis is about. What values we're fighting for, what kind of society we want to build. Think FDR and his generation, the missionary generation, who were the visionary leaders of the last fourth turning. Boomers are meant to play that same role now, though whether they can unite around a common vision rather than fighting each other remains to be seen. The nomad generation, Gen X, are now in midlife. They're the pragmatists, the survivors, the fixers. They grew up during an awakening when nobody was paying attention to them, came of age during an unraveling learning to navigate chaos. And now, in the fourth turning, they're meant to be the practical managers. They're the ones who keep things running when institutions are collapsing. Think of Truman, Eisenhower, Patton from the lost generation in the last fourth turning. They were the pragmatic leaders who got things done. Gen X is meant to play that role now, providing the adult supervision, the practical judgment, the tough decisions that keep society functioning during the crisis. The hero generation, the millennials, are now in young adulthood and early midlife. They're the team players, the can-do optimists, the builders. They grew up during an unraveling with overprotective parents, and they're coming of age during this fourth turning. Historical patterns, show that hero generations are the ones who actually fight the wars, make the sacrifices, do the heavy lifting of the fourth turning, and then, after the crisis, they become the powerful leaders of the next high. Think of the GI generation, the ones who fought World War II and then came home to build the post-war prosperity. Millennials are positioned to play that same role. They're the generation that will actually resolve this crisis, that will build the new institutions, that will shape the high that follows. And finally, the artist generation, Gen Z, and the kids being born now, are growing up during the crisis. They're being raised to be careful, protected, sheltered from the chaos. Historical analysis suggests they'll come of age in the high that follows, and they'll become the sensitive, empathetic, consensus-building leaders during the next awakening. They're being formed by the crisis even though they're not old enough yet to understand it. So when we put all this together, when we combine the fourth turning framework with Turchin's structural demographic analysis with our current observable reality, what story emerges? Research indicates that 2025 through 2032 or so represents the critical period. The point where all the building pressure, all the unresolved contradictions, all the structural weaknesses come to a head. Economic indicators suggest we're living on borrowed time, with debt levels and asset bubbles that can't be sustained indefinitely. Geopolitical tensions indicate that major powers are positioning for conflict. Domestic political data shows polarization reaching breaking points. Climate patterns point to worsening disruptions. Technological change implies massive economic displacement. All of these could serve as the spark that triggers the climax. And here's what makes this moment unique in human history. Previous fourth turnings were national or at most regional affairs. The American Revolution affected Britain and its colonies. The Civil War was purely American. Even World War II, though global in scope, was really about which nations would dominate. But our fourth turning is happening globally. Turchin's data shows that structural demographic pressures are peaking not just in America, but across the developed world. Europe faces similar challenges. China is entering its own period of crisis. The entire post-1945 global order is breaking down simultaneously. This means the resolution of this fourth turning will likely reshape not just America, but the entire global system. What might that look like? Some possibilities based on historical analysis. We could see a complete reorganization of the global economy. The dollar might lose its reserve currency status. A new Bretton Woods-style agreement might create new international financial institutions. Trade patterns that have existed for decades might be completely redrawn. The relationship between government and economy might be fundamentally restructured, the way it was in the 1930s with the New Deal. We could see major geopolitical realignment. The alliances formed after World War II might dissolve. New alliance structures might emerge. The balance of power between the United States, China, Europe, and other regional powers might be decisively settled. Nuclear weapons might be used or might be abolished. The United Nations might collapse or might be completely reformed. We could see radical political restructuring within countries. Constitutional changes, electoral reforms, complete redefinition of political parties and coalitions, major shifts in federalism, in the balance between central and regional government, possibly even territorial changes in extreme scenarios. We could see fundamental transformation in technology's role in society. Artificial intelligence might be brought under comprehensive regulation. The power of tech companies might be broken up. New technologies might enable forms of democracy or economic organization that weren't previously possible. Privacy, security, and human autonomy might be redefined. We could see major social and cultural shifts. Gender roles might be redefined again, the way they were in the 1940s. Racial and ethnic relations might be restructured. Immigration patterns might change dramatically. Religious and secular alignments might shift. The very conception of citizenship, community, and social obligation might be reimagined. And we could see environmental transformation that affects everything else. Climate change might force mass migration, resource conflicts, and complete reorganization of where and how people live. Or conversely, the crisis might finally trigger the massive mobilization needed to address climate change, the way World War II triggered mobilization for that conflict. The point is that by the mid-2030s, if historical patterns hold, the world will look fundamentally different than it does now. The people living then will look back at 2025 the way we look back at 1929, as the year right before everything changed, the last moment of the old world. Now, it's crucial to understand the limitations of this analysis. Neither Strauss and Howe nor Turchin claim their theories can predict specific events. They can't tell you whether there will be a war with China or a civil war in America or a debt crisis or all three. They can only tell you that structural forces are building toward a breaking point, and historical patterns suggest that breaking point is approaching. The specific form the crisis takes depends on choices, on contingency, on the countless decisions made by leaders and ordinary people. What they can tell you is that societies at this stage of the cycle face certain recurring challenges. That institutional weakness reaches a point where major reform becomes necessary. That inequality and elite division reach levels that make the status quo unsustainable. That generational dynamics create specific leadership patterns. And that the resolution of these challenges tends to follow certain patterns. Strong institutions are rebuilt, inequality is reduced, at least for a while, elite cohesion is restored, social solidarity is renewed, and a new civic order emerges that lasts for the next saeculum. But the path from here to there is never smooth. It requires sacrifice, it demands leadership, and it always, in every previous fourth turning, involves significant conflict and loss. Here's what might be most important to understand. Fourth turnings are not just periods of danger, they're also periods of immense opportunity. They're the moments when societies shed what's not working and build what might work better. When innovation flourishes because the old ways have failed. When leadership emerges because the need is so desperate. When ordinary people step up because the situation demands it. The crises that seem so threatening are also the forcing function that makes real change possible. The New Deal wouldn't have happened without the Depression. The Constitution wouldn't have been written without the failure of the Articles of Confederation. The modern civil rights framework wouldn't have emerged without the Civil War and its aftermath. Crisis breaks what's broken and makes space for building something new. For young people, especially millennials and Gen Z, this is simultaneously terrifying and empowering. Historical examination shows that the generation coming of age during a fourth turning gets to rebuild society. They get to decide what the new institutions look like, what values the new order embodies, what problems get priority, what gets preserved from the old world, and what gets left behind. The GI generation that fought World War II came home and built the post-war prosperity, the interstate highway system, the research universities, the social safety net, the space program, and the global institutions that shaped the next 80 years. For all their flaws, they got to build a world. The millennials and Gen Z are being positioned by history to do the same thing. The question is what they'll build. For older generations, the boomers and Gen X, the challenge is different. Historical patterns suggest they need to provide wisdom and practical leadership respectively. Boomers need to articulate a vision compelling enough to unite rather than divide. Gen X needs to keep things functional while transformation happens around them. Both need to recognize that their era of dominance is ending and the younger generations need space to lead. That's always been the hardest part for aging generations, stepping aside, but it's necessary for the cycle to complete. And for everyone, regardless of generation, some things become clear from studying these patterns. First, what we're experiencing isn't random chaos, it's a predictable if frightening phase of a long-term cycle. Understanding that can provide perspective even as it confirms that things are likely to get worse before they get better. Second, the choices we make matter. Fourth turnings don't have predetermined outcomes. Societies that choose wisely, that find unifying leadership, that maintain enough cohesion to act collectively, emerge stronger. Societies that fracture completely can enter long, dark ages. Third, preparation is possible. You can't prevent a fourth turning any more than you can prevent winter, but you can prepare for it. Build resilience. Develop skills, strengthen communities, position yourself and your family to weather the storm and contribute to what comes after. Historical data suggests that by around 2030, we'll have a clearer sense of how this resolves. That's when the climax is expected. That's when the decisive moments will likely occur. Between now and then, all the trends we're seeing, the political polarization, the economic instability, the geopolitical tensions, the social upheaval, are likely to intensify. This isn't pessimism. This is pattern recognition. This is what fourth turnings look like in the years leading up to the climax. After 2030, if the pattern holds, things should start to clarify. The resolution begins. The new order starts to take shape. And by the mid-2030s, we enter a new high, a new era of strong institutions, civic unity, and shared purpose. The crisis will be over. The transformation will be complete. And the generation that lived through it will spend the rest of their lives either celebrating or regretting the choices they made during these critical years. Is this guaranteed? No. These are patterns, not laws of physics. They can be broken, they can be delayed, they can take forms we don't expect. But over 500 years of Anglo-American history, the pattern has held with remarkable consistency. And right now, two completely independent analytical frameworks, one based on generational cycles, one based on mathematical modeling of structural demographic factors, are both saying the same thing. The 2020s and early 2030s are the critical period. This is when it happens. This is when everything that's been building comes to a head. This is when the old order falls and the new order rises. And a decade from now, we'll look back at 2025 and recognize it as the year when we could still see what was coming, when we could still prepare, when we could still choose how we wanted to respond to the challenges ahead. The year right before the climax, the last quiet moment before the storm. So if you found this analysis valuable, if understanding these historical patterns helps you make sense of what seems like senseless chaos, if knowing that this is a predictable phase of a long-term cycle provides some perspective, then make sure you subscribe. Because we're living through one of the most consequential periods in history, and understanding the forces shaping our era isn't just intellectually interesting. It's practically essential. The next few years will determine what the world looks like for the next 80. And whether we choose to understand that or not, whether we choose to prepare or not, whether we choose to lead or follow, those years are coming. The fourth turning is here. The climax approaches. And by the early 2030s, we'll know how this chapter of history ends and what new chapter begins. Don't miss it. Hit that subscribe button. We've got a lot more to unpack about what's coming and how to navigate it. The future is being written right now. You might as well understand the script.